Doamnelor, domnișorilor, și domnilor, se întonează imnul Statelor Unite ale Americii și imnul României. Vă mulțumesc! Dragi studenți, stimați colegi, la început de an avem onoarea să primim vizita Excelenței sale, Domnului Hans Klemm, ambasador al Statelor Unite ale Americii în România, care va vorbi despre Martin Luther King, una dintre personalitățile emblematice ale secolului 20. După încheierea prelegerii, Excelența sa va răspunde cu drag la întrebările pe care studenții le vor adresa domniei sale. Împreună cu Excelența sa, oaspeții ai comunității academice sucevene sunt doamna Klemm, soția ambasadorului, doamna Angela Gemza, atașat de presă, și doamna Ioana Damian, biroul de diplomație publică de la Ambasada Statelor Unite ale Americii. Stimați invitați, alături de studenții și profesorii USV, decanii facultăților, în sală sunt prezenți profesor universitar doctor inginer Valentin Popa, rectorul Universității, și domnul profesor Liviu Popescu, președintele Senatului Universității Ștefan cel Mare din Suceava. Dragi studenți, o invit pe doamna profesor Luminița Turcu, decanul Facultății de Litere și Științe ale Comunicării, facultatea care este promotorul acestui eveniment, să ne facă o scurtă prezentare a excelenței sale, domnului ambasador Hans Klemm, și a temei despre care va conferenția domnia sa, urându-i domnului ambasador realizări deosebite de-a lungul mandatului de ambasador în țara noastră.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome some very special guests from the Embassy of the United States of America in Bucharest, and especially His Excellency Mr. Hans Klemm, a graduate of Indiana University and Stanford University, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and an admirer of Romanian culture, as he himself has recently declared, the Honorable Hans Klemm assumed last year the duties of the United States Ambassador to Romania. Today, he will be sharing with us his reflections on the life and philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday is, by the way, an American federal holiday. He was born on January 15. By some marvelous coincidence, on the same day, January 15, we celebrate the birthday of our national poet, Mihai Eminescu. To millions of Americans, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the prophet of their crusade for racial equality. To millions of Romanians, Mihai Eminescu is the prophet of their struggle for national liberty and individual dignity. I have a dream that one of our students who are now present in this hall will someday become a politician and will remember this meeting and propose a Mihai Eminescu national holiday. This dual celebration in January of both Martin Luther King and Mihai Eminescu will unite us once more in praising two visionaries who wanted their countries to live by the noble principles of love, justice, and truth. With that, I ask you to help me in warmly welcoming to the stage His Excellency, Mr. Hans Klemm. Your Excellency.
Bună ziua tuturor, rector Valentin Popa, profesor Luminița Turcu, stimați profesorii și studenți ai Universității Ștefan cel Mare din Suceava, vă mulțumesc pentru disponibilitatea de a mă primi. Sunt foarte mulțumit să mă aflu aici pentru a discuta despre viața și activitatea lui Martin Luther King Jr. și despre impactul său asupra Statelor Unite și a lumii în general. And now, please allow me to continue in English. That was a marvelous introduction. Thank you very much. I was in Bucharest last Friday, and my wife and I went to a celebration of the Romanian National Culture Day on January 15th, which of course honors the birth of Mihai Eminescu. And I did not make that connection that his birth date coincides with the birth date of Martin Luther King Jr., but in the future I always will do so. And so thank you very much, Madam, for that inspirational call to you to someday become a powerful politician in Romania and to make that day forever a national holiday here in Romania. Dr. King's birthday is celebrated now on the third Monday in January of every year as a public holiday across the United States. The federal government, other institutions, and indeed the United States Embassy in Bucharest were all closed last Monday in order to honor this great American, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What made him such a great man? Well, he saw that America was not living up to its founding ideals and principles, written in our Declaration of Independence in 1776, as well as in the United States Constitution, that all men are created equal. And he challenged the United States to do so, to live up to those principles. Dr. Martin Luther King also realized and firmly believed that one of my country's greatest assets was and remains our diversity. He was a humanitarian, a spiritual leader, a community activist, and eventually a Nobel laureate who continues to inspire and motivate us all today, Romanians and, of course, Americans alike. Dr. King was born to a religious family in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He grew up in the church where his father was the minister. He went on to serve in that same church as pastor after earning a doctorate, a PhD, at Boston University. He married Coretta Scott of Alabama in 1953, and they together had 4 children. Dr. King's religious convictions led him to be socially active and concerned with the plight of his fellow Americans. During his time, African Americans were not treated equally in the United States, where the practice of segregation, of dividing white Americans from black Americans in education and in other fields of society and economy was legally enshrined. This was a practice that was legally enforced in many states across the United States. This meant that separate facilities existed for Negroes and for whites, and the result was that anything for blacks was far less equal than what was available to white Americans. This became particularly obvious in the educational system. White Americans and African Americans did not attend the same schools in the racially divided South, and as strange as this may sound, it was legally protected by laws providing for segregation. However, these laws eventually were challenged. In 1954, in a landmark case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Kansas, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that such practice of segregation in education was in fact unconstitutional and was therefore illegal. Despite this tremendous change in American law, enforcing it and altering people's mindsets was a huge challenge. A year later, in 1955, despite the fact that segregation in education had been declared unconstitutional and illegal, the widespread practice of it still continued, and many laws requiring segregated facilities in other areas of private and public life remained in force. A young woman, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white person in December of 1955, as had been required by law. She was arrested, and the African American community in Montgomery and in many other places around the United States was outraged. The response was an organized boycott of the bus system that lasted for more than a year, for 385 days in Montgomery, which proved to be economically crippling to that city. As a result of the economic pressure that the boycott applied, segregation on the bus system in Montgomery was brought to an end, and the modern civil rights movement in America had begun. During this time, in Montgomery, an unknown preacher from Atlanta emerged as a spokesperson of this movement, and after the Montgomery bus boycott, he became a national figure in the United States, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. King, as previously mentioned, was a Christian minister who espoused the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. He promoted social engagement, protest, and even civil disobedience. However, Dr. King did all this by encouraging the use of nonviolence. His thoughts and writings on justice, particularly his poignant letter from a Birmingham jail, where he noted, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," unquote, remain as valid today as the day he wrote them. Reverend King also said, quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that," end quote. Imagine that, just 60 years ago, after almost 100 years since the formal abolition of slavery, a practice that our former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has referred to as America's birth defect, African Americans were still being treated grossly unfairly in the United States. But a light was beginning to shine. Finally, there were signs of change, but there remained resistance to that change. Tensions were high, and anger on both sides of the issue was plentiful. Along comes a man who, drawing on his religious convictions and moral compass, advocates change, but, like Mahatma Gandhi, through nonviolent civil disobedience. Dr. King, as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led thousands in protests and other organized events throughout the United States, primarily, but not exclusively, in the South. He was seen as one of the greatest orators of the 20th century and never strayed from his mission of promoting equality through nonviolence. On August 28th, in 1963, in Washington, D.C., he made his most famous speech on the steps of the memorial dedicated to President Lincoln, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years before, and thereby freeing those who had been enslaved. Dr. King, before a crowd of approximately 250,000 fellow protesters, the largest gathering Washington had ever seen at that time, spoke of his dream for America, his dream. Quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," end quote. It is interesting to note that on August 28, 2008, 45 years to the day after Dr. King's speech, then Senator Obama accepted the Democrats' nomination to be their candidate for president. Senator Obama, of course, would go on to win that election for the president and become America's first African American chief of state. The I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington put civil rights on the forefront of the domestic agenda. Months later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which finally and fully outlawed discrimination based on race, color, creed, gender, or national origin. This was a major victory for the civil rights movement in the United States and undeniably made America better. The laws that once enshrined segregation were now being torn down and replaced with ones that champion equality. In 1964, Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in using nonviolence in America's struggle with civil rights, diversity, and equality. Dr. King continued his efforts up until the very moment an assassin's bullet took him from us in 1968. He was martyred for what he believed in, but his legacy endures and inspires the belief and hopes of subsequent generations, not just in my country, but around the world. Truly, Dr. King gave all he could for creating what he called the beloved community. This was a vision where inclusion and tolerance reign supreme. All social evils such as poverty and hunger are non-existent because, as the King Center in Atlanta states, international standards of human decency will not allow it. Today, almost 50 years since his death, we are still inspired by the work and legacy of this amazing man. Dr. King's call to action to serve his fellow humanity and to hold America to its founding principles, and to do so through nonviolent ways, still captivates us today. Americans, and indeed others throughout the world, look to Dr. King for spiritual encouragement when challenging the problems of today's world. Here in Romania, I witnessed something in early November of last year that I think Dr. King would have been very proud of. Tens of thousands of Romanians came together throughout the country in peaceful solidarity to demand change, as the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. teaches us to do. I was especially impressed, inspired by the passion of Romanians who sought a brighter future, one where rule of law prevails and anti-corruption is the norm. I hope those same protesters and more will march again to the ballot boxes when it is time to use their ultimate power, their vote, to put into place individuals who will serve as responsible leaders of Romania and stewards for her people. Let me end with one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King. Quote, "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase," end quote. I believe Romania recently has taken a giant first step, and although we cannot see what lies ahead, I have full faith in the people of this great country during this critical election year and in their desire to have a government that will serve them well. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. And I'd be very interested to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stimați studenți, dragi studenți, vă rugăm să formulați întrebări pentru domnul ambasador. Este o ocazie rară ca un reprezentant al unui stat să fie prezent în rândul comunității academice sucevene și este o oportunitate pentru noi de a afla lucruri pe care de multe ori le vedem la televizor sau le citim în ziare, în presă. Vă rog. Întrebările pot fi formulate în limba română sau în limba engleză, avem și traducere.
Okay?
Yes.
So, 50 years after Martin Luther's death, how do Americans still consider their fight for freedom? How do they view it in the term of their mindset? Martin Luther said that right before dying, one day before dying, that he has been to the mountaintop. And do Americans, 50 years later, in terms of their openness and respecting each individual for whatever they have to give to society, where do they stand now?
Thank you. Excellent question. This work of ensuring that all Americans are treated equally before the law continues. It did not end with Dr. King's work in the 1960s. It did not end with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It did not end with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It continues to this very day. Just in the past, I would say 18 months, for example, there has been widespread demonstrations in the United States, again by African Americans, who are concerned that they do not receive equal treatment, for example, by the police. In the last year or 2 years, there have been a number of incidents in St. Louis, in Cleveland, in Baltimore, and other towns and cities in the United States where Black Americans, African Americans, have been the victims of police shootings. And in some cases, the courts have found that the police acted illegally in using that violence against those individuals. And a movement has started. It's entitled Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. That have been mounting protests in many cities across America. Again, concerned that that they are facing unequal treatment by police forces in many American cities. There's also, in the 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King did his work to try to end discrimination against African Americans, against poor people, against other minorities in the United States, there have been movements, for example, to improve the rights enjoyed by women, to improve the rights enjoyed by Native Americans. But this is very much a work that is unfinished, a work that's unfinished in the United States and in many countries around the world.
Next questions, please. Întrebări, vă rog.
Your Excellency, I have a question. Do you think the ideals and the methods of Martin Luther King's could still be used today in different systems where racial and ethnical conflicts still exist in order to find solutions?
Yes, I do. I do believe it is possible, and yes, I do. I hope these methods are used by minorities or representatives of minority communities who feel that they are mistreated by the majorities in which they live. I think this is there are probably many examples in the world where these situations exist. I can think of examples, for example, in the Middle East, but I would also be quick to refer to my own country, where again, the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, the work of many Americans who wish to ensure that all of our citizens are treated equally before the law and are given full respect, remains unfinished. But the practice, the nonviolent practices that Martin Luther King espoused and supported, I still believe are the best and most legitimate means of addressing practices that are discriminatory against minorities.
Next. Da, vă rog, fetele, haideți.
Okay, Your Excellency, I have a question too. Yeah, it's me. Hi. Why do you think Martin Luther King decided to fight for this cause only when he heard about Rosa Parks? Because he was required to do the same thing, and he didn't fight then, but only when he heard about this woman. Do you think it had something to do with his mother, who was also killed by a white man?
It was just about a year ago that I read an extensive biography of Martin Luther King, and I only covered the period through 1963. When he was young and when he went to school and was in training to become a pastor, that was his ambition, like his father before him. I don't think there was much evidence that he intended to take on the role that he eventually assumed, and that was to be really the leader of the civil rights movement in America. He initially had did some work as a pastor in Atlanta, Georgia, and then the opportunity presented itself for him to be the head of the church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he went there somewhat reluctantly. His father was against him going to Montgomery. His wife was not particularly enthusiastic about it. But he saw that he would have the opportunity to run a church by himself. And so he moved to Montgomery. And then Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus in the late fall of 1955. And Dr. King found himself really not without the intention to, found himself at the forefront of an effort to overturn some of this practices of segregation in Montgomery. He became very much involved in the organization of the bus boycott, and then other actions that were taken to end the practice of discrimination in terms of the ability of African Americans, of Negroes to ride on buses, on any seat in the buses of Montgomery. But again, that was not his intention when he first moved to Montgomery. But once he became involved and engaged in the fight against segregation, in the fight to ensure full equality for African Americans and other minorities in the United States, it really became his life's work. It was through practice that he took on this responsibility. It was through the exposure that Martin Luther King had to the evils of segregation firsthand in Montgomery, Alabama. It was really to his realization that the fight against segregation needed the leadership, and that perhaps he was the man chosen by God, I think, as he would say, to lead that struggle. It was only then that he assumed that leadership, and that did not come easily either. There were other rivals in the civil rights movement who also had a claim to the mantle of leadership, and it was only due to the success that Martin Luther King had in organizing protests against segregation that allowed him to eventually emerge as the true leader of the civil rights movement over time.
Please.
Mr. Ambassador, if I may, I would like to bring the discussion to a situation from our days. And I would like to hear your opinion about that. Concerning the situation of the immigrants in Europe, do you think they need their Dr. Martin Luther King for the integration in all these nationalities, or do you think their integration would be easier?
I don't think it will be easy. The numbers of the refugees and the migrants that are coming to Europe today the numbers are so large that it will be a challenge even for the largest and most wealthy country or countries like Germany and Sweden to successfully and quickly integrate the refugees that they are receiving and welcoming. This is truly an enormous challenge for Europe, for the European Union, and for Romania as well. Romania has largely been able to avoid the crush of the refugees because they've chosen a different route to enter Europe. But as a member of the European Union, I think the people of Europe and those in the developed world that are concerned about the large number of migrants and refugees leaving the very troubled Middle East, I think there's an expectation that Romania too must play its fair role in sheltering these people.
Thank you for your answer.
Please.
Good afternoon. I have a question too. So I've heard that the situation of African Americans is still a cliche for Americans, but they're still fighting it. They have like their intern culture. They have their own things that. I don't know. There are cities where people are still afraid to walk at night on the street. If they want changes, why are they fighting it still? I mean, makes no sense. What do you think about that?
Well, I think a great deal of progress has been accomplished in the United States in terms of the treatment that minorities in America face, both in treatment before the law, as well as treatment as full members of American society and the American economy. I come from Detroit, Michigan, a city that when I grew up in the 1960s and 1967, 1968, saw very destructive race riots. And Detroit, to a large extent, never recovered from that violence, and still suffers and carries the scars of what occurred in the 1960s. Also in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, and a city in which I have lived for many years. There too, there was very destructive violence in the 1960s. It's only really now or in the past 5 to 10 years, that the city finally has recovered from the wounds of that violence, that the parts of Washington, D.C. where the riots were concentrated finally have economically recovered and become safe places during day or night for both African Americans as well as white Americans of other backgrounds to walk, as you say. America, despite its wealth, still has a very large number of poor people, and African Americans, unfortunately, still make up a very large proportion of the poor in America. And if you compare white Americans to African Americans, but also Asian Americans to black Americans, there's much less economic progress seen for African Americans than for other minorities in the United States. So America, I think, is very aware that this is a never-ending process, that is to try to ensure that all of our citizens enjoy the same, not only the same rights, but the same opportunities for advancement. And it's a work that we will continue to have to exert ourselves against for many more years to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your Excellency mentioned before that Dr. Martin Luther King was striving to become a pastor. What does Your Excellency believe that religion, what part did it play in his philosophy?
I think a critical one. I cannot imagine that he would have found himself as the leader of the civil rights movement if he had not had the background of both growing up in the family, which his father was a preacher, and then also his own ambitions to become a preacher. His religious studies and his faith were critical to the formation of his ideas, and then also the formation of his approach to the fight against segregation, and the core of which was his belief in nonviolent protests against segregation. So his religion, he was very much a religious man. That was not a secondary occupation of Dr. King's. He was the son of a preacher. He studied to be a preacher. He believed deeply in God, in the Lord Jesus Christ, and that was fundamental to him and the work that he was able to accomplish.
Next, please.
Your Excellency, I also have a question too, if I may. Many white people were also killed because they fought for the same cause of Dr. Martin Luther King. Why do you think that happened? Because they were afraid of a change?
Why did their killers do what they did? Yes, I would say that they were afraid of change. You're right. If you look at those who lost their lives during the civil rights struggle in the 1950s, and particularly in the 1960s, there are certainly many black Americans, but there also were white Americans who became inspired by Dr. King and other leaders of the civil rights movement for the courage that they had in stepping forward to fight nonviolently against discrimination and segregation. There was a very good movie made about 2 years ago, and it was shown or released in the United States and around the world last year. It was called Selma, and it was about a protest in Selma, Alabama that Dr. King led, I believe, in 1964. And one of the striking things in that movie was the images of violence, the brutal violence that the protesters against segregation faced by those who were, as you put it, afraid of change. And it was both white Americans as well as black Americans who were victims of that violence.
Thank you.
Next, please.
Good evening, Your Excellency. I have a question too. How do you think inclusion policies should be formulated and put into action in order to reduce at the minimum ethnic and racial discrimination? Thank you.
Well, I guess we should follow both the model of Dr. King, both in his writings as well as his action. There's been a great deal of work now about how best to structure nonviolent protests. I remember in school reading the works of Saul Alinsky, for example, who did a great deal of theoretical work on nonviolent protests. And these practices are still being used today. For example, in the wake of the great economic recession that the United States faced, that Romania faced in 2008, 2009, there was a movement in the United States called the Occupy movement. And these were, again, people who were representing, or at least they believed that they were representing those who were victimized by some of the practices that led up to the recession of 2008, 2009, and in nonviolent, using nonviolent methods, they occupied certain areas of major American cities to raise awareness about some of the policies as well as practices by key actors in the U.S. Economy, especially in financial services, and the consequences of those policies and practices, what the consequences were for the American economy. So nonviolent protests, there's both theory and practice behind it, but they're very much still a feature of our life today.
Thank you. Next, please.
Your Excellency, I have a question about what you mentioned earlier, the numerous movements that have been created after for different purposes. And I wanted to ask you about how do you feel about these people who misunderstand, misuse, or abuse or think that they are just privileged about being black or white or women or of certain religion.
I'm sorry, could you state that again? I'm not sure I understood the question.
There are a lot of people who misuse or make abuse of some of the privilege. They think they are privileged because of, and they come in these movements like Black Lives Matter, and they say like, I'm black, you can't do that to me, you can't talk like that to me. They simply make abuse. They believe they are superior just because they belong to a certain area people.
I'm certain there are individuals like that that are using these concerns and movements to advance their own selfish interests, but I think it's important to look at what's motivating the majority of the people and whether there is in fact causes at root for their unhappiness. I'm much more inclined to believe that the majority, for example, in America, should first look at itself and question whether there are changes that should be implemented to improve the lives of all Americans, than to point fingers at individuals in these movements who may be using them for their own personal gain.
Next, please.
Hello. In your opinion, what are the main challenges that Romania faces nowadays?
One thing I believe that is missing in Romania is a vision for its future. I understand that in the 1990s, for example, after the revolution, that Romanians largely came to a consensus about two goals. One is to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to ensure Romania's security, and the second was to join the European Union, so that Romania could fully become a member of Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. Since accomplishing those two goals, first in 2004 with entry into NATO, and then 2007 with entry in the European Union, I hear this from many Romanians, that there's no longer a vision for Romania's future, for the coming generation of young Romanians. And so maybe it's time for Romania to set a vision for itself. Say that, for example, Romania is the sixth largest country in terms of population in the European Union. Perhaps in 20 years it should be the sixth richest country in the European Union, or simply be as wealthy as France in a generation, in 20 or 25 years. And once setting that vision, set about to accomplish it. And then the leaders of Romania would have to kind of work back in order to grow fast enough to become as wealthy as France in 25 years. This is what we have to do. We have to invest in infrastructure. We have to invest in our people. We have to invest in our public administration. We have to invest in our health system. All of these things are necessary for Romania, or would be if Romania was to try to reach that goal of being one of the more wealthy members of the European Union. And I say this because what the United States really wants in its alliance with Romania, in its partnership with Romania, in its friendship with Romania, is a strong Romania, a strong, democratic, and prosperous Romania. The United States would be very happy if Romania was as wealthy as Luxembourg or as France, because Then, as we together work to ensure a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace, and as we together strive to bring an end to the conflict in the Middle East, the United States would have as a partner, as an ally and a friend, a very wealthy Romania, able to bring additional resources to those common goals.
Thank you. Next, please.
What are some of the resources Romania has that it hasn't taken advantage of, exploited so far?
Well, I think it's people, primarily. I think the Romanian people offer a great deal of potential that has not been fully exploited. And in order to do that, proper investments need to be made in the health system, in the education system. Its political system must be cleaned up. Romania has done an admirable job in fighting corruption over the past 5 or 10 years. It's becoming an example for the region, for your neighbors. That fight needs to continue so that the culture of corruption is eventually eliminated. Investments in your public administration must be made to ensure that your government is non-political, professional, responsive, transparent, consultative, seeks the views of Romanians before making policy changes or passing new laws. All of this is necessary in order to fully have available and exploit and use the talents of Romania's people.
Next questions.
How can U.S.-Romania business and cultural ties be strengthened?
That is one of my jobs as United States Ambassador, is to deepen the cultural and commercial ties between our two countries. I have 3 priorities. One is to promote the security of our 2 countries, and a great deal has already been done in this area in terms of military cooperation. One area that I would like to exert more energy on is in energy security. Romania can play a greater role in ensuring that there is a diverse source of energy available to Europe and diverse networks of supply of energy to Europe. So promoting security. And then another priority of mine is to promote democracy. This is not to question Romania's embrace of a democratic future, of democratic values, but as in America, our institutions are always evolving, and as you seek to consolidate and strengthen your democratic institutions, the United States wants to help. And one example of that is the work that we're doing to support your fight against corruption in cooperation between our law enforcement agencies, to fight corruption, to fight organized crime, to fight terrorism. And then the third priority, after promoting security, after promoting democracy, is to promote prosperity. And that is to increase the flow of trade and goods and services between our 2 countries, to increase the flow of American investment in Romania, to also increase the flow of Romanian investment in the United States. Romanian firms would benefit from working and operating in the United States, the most competitive marketplace in the world. But also I would like to promote a greater exchange between our people and our institutions, institutions of higher learning. I was very interested to hear from your rector about the cooperation that exists between the University of Suceava and, for example, the University of Maryland and Howard University and Florida State University. And perhaps there are other colleges and universities in the United States that we could introduce to the University of Suceava and build relations. But also in the area of science, technology, and culture. I think perhaps using the Fulbright program as a platform, what more can be done to create links between the United States and Romania, and to build understanding between our two peoples and two societies.
Next, please.
And both Martin Luther King and, let's say, Malcolm X, they each had religious support by their side in a time that was, well, not so long ago, but what it seems to me as my Romanian belief is that, my question is that belief still enough to create such motivation in people to just rally around another cause, to see in belief of whatever God, but religion, just religion? Is it still a motivator good enough for people, let's say even in Romania, to gather together and just go in some direction from that point?
Very good question. And I think there are similarities here between that can be noted looking at both the United States and Romania. Both of our countries are very religious when compared to other countries for example, in Europe or in North America. The number of Americans who say that they are very religious, the number of Americans who go to church on a regular basis, the number of Americans who say that religion is a very important part of their lives and an important driver of their values and views is very high compared to other developed countries, and it's true in Romania as well. And the church, for example, in Romania is one of the most trusted institutions. That's true also in the United States. But being a religious society alone does not ensure that, unfortunately, does not ensure that we are a fair and equal society, one that does not permit the discrimination or unfair treatment of other citizens. So this requires strong judicial systems and work by the government to ensure that all people are treated equally before the law. And both in America and in Romania, ensuring a strong independent judiciary is something that will not happen by its own. It requires conviction and resources and determination.
Thank you.
Last questions. Vă rog, ultima întrebare.
I'm not a student, but I would like to ask something, because it seems that something is missing from here. I've been in the US for many years, and what it seems to me that the most important thing in changing the mentalities, because this was the problem. You see, we have no discrimination law in Romania, but still we have minority discriminated. So it's not the law. It's not necessarily the religion, as you mentioned, but what it happened was the education. So for the educational system, somehow the American mentality has changed, and people has accepted I think, and they have even a better view of minorities than we have in Europe now. We start, let's say you started from behind, but in 40 years, through education, that has changed. And since we are in the university here, I would like to emphasize this.
Well, that's a very good point, Professor. And as I said in my speech, as Dr. King recognized, changing mentalities is a very difficult task, a very difficult undertaking, a very difficult challenge. and it sometimes takes years, if not decades, to accomplish. Another thing that occurred in the United States very, very recently in the past year was a debate over symbols that in many states still existed on state flags, the symbol of the Confederacy, one of the America, when it created its Constitution, legalized slavery. Some 80 years after the Constitution was enacted, America entered into a 5-year-long civil war, a very, very bloody war. And one consequence of that war was finally the ending of slavery in 1863, and then in 1865 our Constitution was changed to finally take out the provisions that had permitted slavery and make other changes to try to ensure that all men are treated equally before the law. But that didn't happen, as I discussed in my speech, as Martin Luther King was later to dedicate his life to. There were 100 years after the Civil War, after the ending of slavery, there were still laws in place that essentially ensured a segregated society, that white Americans were legally separate from black Americans. And it was only as a result of Martin Luther King's work and the civil rights movement that those laws were finally eliminated. But still, prejudice existed, prejudice continued, and symbols of prejudice and segregation and slavery were still evident in American life on the flags of some of our states, and because they included the Confederate flag of the Civil War era, and this for me is an example of how slowly mentalities change. And you're absolutely right, Professor. One key means of changing structures of consciousness, of mentalities, is through education.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Dragi studenți, îl aplaudăm pe domnul ambasador pentru această lecție de istorie deosebită, pentru această lecție de demnitate umană, de o analiză a relațiilor internaționale și a contextului în care evoluează lumea astăzi și România în special. Este și un îndemn pe care vi l-a adresat, poate acele sfaturi pe care le-a adresat în răspunsul său clasei noastre politice, dacă nu vor fi auzite de cei care sunt astăzi alături de noi, ne conduc destinele, le veți putea transpune în acțiuni practice domniile voastre atunci când veți deveni absolvenții Universității Ștefan cel Mare din Suceava, o universitate care se mândrește cu locul pe care îl ocupă în învățământul național românesc și cu care suntem siguri că vă mândriți și voi că sunteți studenți ai acestei universități. Încă o dată îi mulțumim domnului ambasador. Orice eveniment al Universității Ștefan cel Mare din Suceava se încheie cu imnul Universității, un imn care dorește să onoreze pe generațiile care au întemeiat această universitate, dar și pe patronul Universității Ștefan cel Mare, un imn compus de către compozitorul Bogdan Ota. Vă invităm să audiem imnul Universității Ștefan cel Mare din Suceava. mulțumesc. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention. Pentru atenție lui dumneavoastră, mulțumesc foarte mult. Thank you.